Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James Christian Blockwood. This week, we're sharing a special presentation, highlights from the most recent installment of our Critical Conversations event series, a 360-degree view of national security. This event featured Jane Holl Lute, former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Mike McCord, former Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer at the Defense Department, and Peter Levine, Senior Fellow of the Institute for Defense Analyses. This was a great event with 3 expert fellows, all sharing their views on the rapidly changing national security and homeland security environment. Let's talk at a higher level here. We have a lot going on. If you were to read the news, we have conflicts overseas. We have changing either trade agreements or agreements with other countries. We have concerns about global competitiveness and how technology might affect that. All of that's related to national security. But national security can mean different things to different people. So when we say national security in 2025, what does that encompass? And maybe, Mike, you could start.
I think what we mean by national security is not necessarily as constant as it was when I started in this business. Today, when someone says that, I might mean my concern about letting Ukraine get swallowed by Russia and the impact on European security. You might be thinking maybe more fentanyl, border security, cybersecurity, combating disinformation. Maybe Peter's thinking China, which is what probably a lot of people would vote for, competitiveness on the military front, the economic front, the diplomatic front, technological front, primacy in the Pacific, all those sort of things. Someone else might think critical infrastructure, public health, pandemic preparedness. So it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. The term started getting used, I think, in law, especially right after World War II. National Security Acts of 47 and 1949 created the structure that we have now, a National Security Council, a CIA, a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all those sort of structures. And so there was an interagency thought even back then, but then for the next 40 years, the primary focus of a national security strategy was Soviet Union, which was largely military competition, but also obviously diplomatic competition for allies and influence around the world. Fast forward to the end of the Cold War, it was no longer obvious what national security was or what a national security strategy should be. So that's when Congress told the executive branch to start producing a national security strategy. And you started to see the phrase, even I think the very first one, if not the second one, whole of government, coming into the way we talked about national security strategies. And I should say strategy is important. If you don't have a strategy to guide you, you're really going to struggle to spend the resources that we spend effectively. So it's a good idea to have one. That being said, you're going to get judged, especially if you're a president, by how well you handle what actually happens in the real world, whether it aligned with what your strategy said, you needed to focus on or not. But you do need that strategy to guide you. And I think the definitions have changed over time and morphed a little bit more into what we now call Homeland Security, especially after 9/11.
Given the threats that we have right now, some of the changes that you're seeing, Mike, what do you think our current capability is? And is it sufficient to address the things that you might think we need to?
Starting with the military side, our current capability is enormous, actually. It is the best in the world. Doesn't mean that it is so much superior to everything else that you can always get what you want, but it is the best in strictly the military terms. On technology, which I think is emerging in most people's minds as a real area of struggle or of competition, that is not the case. On things like AI and quantum computing, jury's out. I mean, it might be us that ends up in the lead. It might be China, to name our most prominent competitor. And I think that's why China has been at the top of the list of our concerns fairly consistently across the last 15 years or so, because they have that combination of economic, diplomatic, military, technological prowess to compete seriously with us. So I think those are emerging as areas. One thing I think that has been more prominent recently on the technology front in particular is what most people refer to as drones. Here you see something that is just not that hard to do. We do it well, but lots of people do it well. And so competing in that space, whether it's the Houthis or someone else, is difficult. The technology changes quickly. And again, we're not doing it badly, but we don't have anything approaching, I would say, dominance in that space of offense versus defense, just because the technology is proliferated so widely. So I think as you look at a high-end system like the B2 that Peter mentioned, nobody has anything to compete with that. But in areas that are, I think, widely seen to be crucial, like again, AI and quantum computing, the jury's out on that.
When you think about capability, you kind of want to match it to, well, what's the role you think the United States should be playing in the national security arena? Jane, what do you think the U.S. role should be globally, and how does that match whatever strategy we do have or whatever capabilities you think?
This is kind of a core question. What's your theory of the case when it comes to the U.S. role in the world? And related to that, if we're talking about defense, the unique capabilities Mike talked about are real. We can get anywhere in the world from Missouri, apparently. Right. We can see any enemy before they can see us. We can engage and kill any enemy before they can kill us. We can do it 24 hours a day. And there was a time, and there may still be a time, when we could bring more friends to our party than anyone else. These are unique capabilities that we have. And if you really want to get precise, there are some magical keys that the United States has from a military point of view. One of them is the NCO Corps. It is a magical key of capability for us. No one has anything like it. The Brits come close, the French come close. No one else comes really as close to the United States in terms of what our non-commissioned officer corps can do and does do for the United States military. We have other things like sustainability. But when you think about America's role in the world, what do we do with this enormous capacity? So the question, the fifth era that I think we're entering, and the dominant question, at least that in the conversations that I'm having internationally, that people are asking themselves, we are clearly in a period, we've entered fully a 20-year period of global reordering, okay? Will the world be able to navigate this period in relative peace without decisive U.S. leadership? That's the question, if the U.S. is retreating from its engagement around the world. So if you begin to think about the U.S. role, I really begin to think about, what does this country need? What do we need right now at this moment in our history? Well, we need a safe and secure homeland. We need a dynamic economic engine that can generate new wealth. We need strong friends and allies, because notwithstanding how great our force is, force can't do all that needs doing, and all that needs doing can't be done alone. And we need predictable relations with others. That's actually a pretty low bar. I don't need to know exactly what you're going to do, but if I can predict a bandwidth of behavior, and that's really all about the rule of law that has been legitimately derived, widely promulgated, understood, and broadly accepted. That's what the United States needs at this moment in its history. So when I think about the U.S. role in the world, I think we have unique capabilities. I think we have been, by and large, a benign influence going over the past decades. Benign in the sense of we have really looked at the global space and global conflict. We were the architects of major international institutions and multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN, whether it's NATO. These organizations were designed for assertive U.S. engagement. We're not particularly good in a defensive crouch. We're not particularly good, sort of looking the other way. We are at our best. We are at our most authentic when we see a problem out there and we try to solve it. And similarly, and I really want to come back to your point, because I agree with that 100%, the only place you really invest in the public sector is in people. You don't invest in buildings. You don't invest in programs. You really invest in people, because you will get a return, most obviously in their discretionary time. But that requires that our institutional leaders have an idea of what it is they're trying to do. A small example, and I can't resist, frankly, when we got to DHS was unauditable back in 2009, unauditable. And we got a clean audit opinion, mostly because I was a bureaucratic terrorist and held meetings and said, you're coming to this meeting. And we're going to start with financials, and we're going to move our way. And it has still a clean audit opinion. DOD is still, I think, working on that. But the public has a right to know where the money's going, how it's being spent. And if there are excesses and inefficiencies, these are political dollars. They're going to be spread around. And that's a reality we have to accept. Coming back to your question, what is the U.S. role in the world? I think we are at our best when we are clear-eyed, assertive, and engaged.
We have a tendency to focus on what we're doing today and think we're going to make a difference in 6 months because they're fielding things every 6 months, instead of going back and diagnosing the problem and saying, some of this problem is, what were we doing 20 years ago? We were fighting wars in the Middle East. We were focused with our military on today's problem and fighting today's problem, and we weren't investing in the future. What were the Chinese doing? They were at home investing in the future. All their money was going into this investment. And their programs that are maturing today, many of them were initiated at that time. My point coming back around is that the decisions that we make today will tell us where we're going to be 20 years from now in the same way. And so if we disinvest in human capital, we can destroy kinds of capabilities that we have today. We might not have them in 20 years. If we don't invest in alliances, we might not have those alliances in 20 years. We can rely on them today because we built them 20 years ago. It's not just military hardware. It's human capital, it's alliances, it's our role in the world. Those are things we need to invest in today if they're going to be there for us 20 years from now.
Continuity is not a given in our political system. Different administration comes in with a different priority, but continuity, as Peter has described with the B-2, something that was conceived in the 80s, actually, in secret, is important to getting things done. I mean, hard work is a given. I think I can't speak to DHS. I didn't work there, but I expect very similar to what we experience. People work very hard. They have a sense of mission, and you need that civilian and military working hard. That's almost a given. But if there's no continuity, you're not going to reap the full benefits. In addition to all some of the things Peter talked about, the human capital, you need, and I know you want to talk this morning about skill sets. I think you need some diversity in not just the career versus political, which is inherent, but also different experiences and backgrounds, or else nobody's going to ask the question of, the career person gets that kind of focus of why we do it this way. And here's what happened the last time we tried something else. But you do need the new views coming in of, well, what if we tried it this way? So I think that's an aspect of diversity that you need in your workforce. And also something that Chuck Hagel, one of the secretaries I work for, was a good teacher of this point, that especially in DoD, if you work in DoD a long time, you become a professional worrier. Threats and challenges all over the place that you come in the morning worrying about A and B and C and what is China doing. You need people who can see opportunity as well as the problems and the challenges, and that's not a given.
I think good management really comes down to three things: people, money, and things. Things meaning science and technology or services that might be offered. I'd be remiss if I didn't go back and say that I worked at the Government Accountability Office, and one of the examples of good leadership with intentionality is Homeland Security and its ability to take a large, complex organization, understand what it has, who it has, and how it wants to use it, and successfully pass an audit. The Department of Defense, equally complex, has not necessarily been able to do that with any regularity. Can you shed any light as to why that might be the case?
I would disagree. I would disagree with the premise that they're equally complex. I would say the Department of Defense is orders of magnitude more complex than the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security, as I understand it, and I have nowhere near the understanding that Jane does, but as I understand it, is an aggregation of a number of disparate units with disparate missions, which means that if you can get each one of them individually auditable, you have a chance of getting the whole thing auditable. Department of Defense is a single organic institution with a single mission, and all of its different components are supporting that mission and interacting with each other and doing business with each other, so that you can't get, it doesn't really do you any good. We have units of the Department of Defense that are auditable. That's not really, it's viewed as a building block toward auditing the department as a whole. It isn't really that helpful of a building block toward auditing the department as a whole, because you could actually get all of the individual units auditable, and you still wouldn't be auditable as a whole because there's so much business and interaction between them and so much complexity in that business. I view DoD more like an economy than just a single entity. And the buying and selling from each other, the layers and structures of it, make it very difficult. There are hundreds of different business systems in the department because there's so many different mission sets that contribute to the overall mission set. So the level of complexity, we've had some of the same people who work with Jane in Homeland Security come over to DoD and think they were going to solve the DoD problems, and the DoD problems are still there. And it's not because they're not working hard, and not because they haven't pulled everybody into the room and read them the riot act and said, you got to do this. It's because the problem is really, really hard.
So I have to respond to that, Peter. And I understand the spirit in what you're saying. I mean, DoD is 10 times the size of DHS. Okay. So that may be slightly reduced with the influx of budget to DHS. And having spent the first half of my adult life in the military, I have a feel for that complexity, and I like very much the notion that it's an economy and not an organization. I mean, it's got properties of an organization and properties of an economy. I accept that. I do not accept it's unauditable. I don't accept that. I accept that it's hard. when you're a parent, a lot of us are parents, and you have a kid and, you don't really know what to say. You resort to Broadway show lyrics, or TV shows. My daughter the other day said to me, she said, Mama, I work very hard. I said, so does a washing machine. So, which is a line from a movie, not original to me. And believe me, I used to, when I was deputy secretary, go around, at night, a lot of meetings you have at night, and you see lights on in the building. And there's somebody missing their kids, school performance, or, their spouse's a maternity appointment or whatever, because they're working really hard. And it's true. There's no question about it. I don't accept that it's unaudible. And we should not accept that as a country, where it's difficult. I get that. It's a challenge. But it also comes down to, when leaders come in, what do you want to do in the 4 years, let's say, that you have? When I came in, the secretary asked me, he said, okay, what do you want to get done? I said, I want a clean audit opinion. I want to get off the GAO high risk list. By the way, I'll come back to that. I want to reduce our unacceptably high suicide rate that we had. And I want to begin a leadership program for our civilian colleagues, because there is none. And so then Peter said, DOD has a single mission: fight and win the nation's wars. Homeland Security has multiple missions, and these missions are in tension with each other. Borders, we want to keep our borders secure, right? We want to keep out people and things that might be dangerous, but we also want to expedite legitimate trade and travel. Those two things are in tension with each other. And that introduces an element, and I could talk about immigration this way, I could talk about emergency response, cybersecurity, right? But our leaders need a clear idea. What do we want government to do? In cybersecurity, I'll tell you, we want you to get the federal act together. We want you to engage constructively with the private sector, because we don't want government in all our networks doing everything, and they can't do it anyway. And we want to build national resilience in the face of an onslaught of cyber threats. So it comes back, I think, James Christian, to your original question is, what is the role of government? Once we have a sense of that, what do we want government to do? And then what is the role of the United States in the world when it comes to addressing questions of our national security?
I think the size and complexity is a challenge for DoD. We would be about the it would be about the 30th biggest country in the world if its budget was a GDP. So it is the size of an economy. But that being said, it is not bigger than the state of California's. So it's not that alone is a reason. I think that the challenges are, DoD actually has a handle now on all its finances. It's $800 or $900 billion of funding that flows through. It's the property. The DoD has more than twice the property of all the rest of the government combined. So about 65, 70% of all the government's property, weapons, buildings, things that are in DoD. And those are a challenge, along with the proliferation of systems that do a particular function but don't necessarily do audit well. And then it competes poorly, honestly, with for senior leader time with all the many other things on DoD leaders' plates on an average day. So I think that's an issue as well.
I'll take nothing away from anyone at DoD. I believe everyone is working hard towards the mission. And I will leave for another debate the complexity of different organizations. But I do think it is worth noting that when we talk about capability, and you're talking about people, you're talking about the different equipment, you're talking about money that's going in and out, it does need to be auditable. And we need to figure that out if we want to make sure that we have the strongest organization going forward. Let me zoom back out and ask a broader question. We talked about the role of the United States and kind of this global order. We're talking about capability, and we haven't spent as much time about the threats or challenges. It'd be really hard to mention just one, but if you can, what would be some of the top challenges you think the national security apparatus faces?
I think what's emerged a lot that's maybe different than 10 years ago, as I said, China has been pretty consistent. I think, as Peter noted, they've innovated generally faster than we expected them to. And so that's a concern. But I would say 10 years ago, cyberspace and outer space, as some people used to call it, were areas where competition and conflict were likely, but not yet certain. I think we've moved, unfortunately, to where it is absolutely certain now that these are areas where state and non-state actors will try to influence, control, or even harm other people, other actors, right? In both cyberspace and in space, as where if there's a major power conflict, it's going to be fought in space as well. Whereas, much earlier in the Cold War, when there was only sort of the two polar things, not blinding each other was considered pretty important to avoiding nuclear war. That is no longer a given. So I think those have emerged in prominence. Taking Jane's point that Homeland Security is not necessarily the same thing, but I would say in the public's mind, at least, it appears that border security, fentanyl maybe are more prominent
No
than they used to
question.
be. Organized terrorism, less so.
I would say that what you perceive as threats depends to a significant extent on what you perceive as your own values. Many decades, we defined our interests by opposition to the Soviet Union and the communist world. And that enabled us to say, well, we believe in things like free trade and capitalism and freedom of people and freedom of speech and things like that. That became a little bit unmoored at the end of the Cold War. And I think we had our definition of what threats were and what our interests were wandered a little bit. I think we started then to define our interests in opposition to authoritarianism, and with China and Russia being sort of the poles of the opposite of what we were interested in. But I think that we're wandering a little bit on that now. I don't think that we have clearly defined what our values are in the world, and that makes it harder for us to define what the threats are. If we don't really see Russia as a threat, we don't see that the things that their government is doing as being antithetical to us, then that's not a threat we need to be prepared for. If we do see that as antithetical to our interests, then it's different. But you have to define what your own interests are and what your own values are in order to be able to clearly define the threats.
Yeah. And you do have the ability to set a strategy based on your values or your interest or any combination of what you perceive to be values and interest. And as Peter mentioned, capabilities or threats. And there's a fine line between saying the things that threaten me are A, B, and C, and therefore my strategy is to counter A, B, and C, or I need to be capable to do D, E, and F, regardless of whether I perceive I always want to be able to do D, E, and F. There's some ability to flex as to whether you do threat-based, capability-based, values-based, interest-based, but you have to have something or you really are wandering around spending a lot of money.
So the four things I think the U.S. needs, a safe and secure place where our way of life can thrive, a dynamic economic engine that can generate new wealth, very high bar, strong friends and allies, and predictable relations. Okay, that's what I think we need. That's what we're trying to protect. That's the kind of world but the United States has always needed to have really, I call it binocular vision. My husband says it's the wrong metaphor, but we need a view not only of ourselves, but the world we want to be in. Okay, and we have been singularly effective at influencing both of those aspects of, the American way of life and finding our way in the world. When I think about threats, the Chinese don't keep me up at night, the Russians don't keep me up at night. No country in the experience of the modern world has been willing to lead with accepting the responsibilities of that leadership like the United States. I don't worry about any other country. We're the only ones who have accepted that responsibility and have played out that responsibility with the creation of institutions, more broadly with the conduct of our foreign and defense policy. But I think if you're really coming back to the core issue, what's the biggest threat? A national security threat that the United States faces right now? That we will lose faith in each other. That's the biggest threat. That we will lose faith in each other. Because if we do, and our system collapses and our institutions give way to this fear and this otherness and this hatred within, the rest is commentary, as we say in my religious tradition. The rest is commentary.
Let me just say, I generally agree with Jane's values, and I think you stated them very eloquently. I'm not sure that either the United States government or the United States people share those values in the same way today that they did 15, 20 years ago.
I think moderates need a Me Too movement because there's a lot more moderates out there. This is a pretty prudent country. It's a pretty prudent country, and most people are pretty moderate in terms of what they want. Where we're a little bit adrift is what's the role of government in our lives? Americans don't interact with government unless we have to. None of us interact with government unless we have to. So what are our expectations? What do we want government to do for us? Similarly, we've thrown force at a lot of problems over the last 20 years. And you could say, really, what was your theory of the case? What was force good for fixing? Because we know how to do it really well. But did we fix anything with it? Not really. So I think we leaders, we have an obligation to go back to the drawing board and think really clearly through these kinds of questions before we accept the responsibility of leadership of these men and women who are really working very hard.
I would just agree with both Jane and Peter on that point. Peter and I came in at similar times to the Senate, where we worked before we went to the executive branch, and I think there's a different and not in a good way set of norms and expectations about what Congress is capable of doing, should be doing, both on accomplishment and on the bipartisan way of accomplishing things that should trouble most people, of what is now considered acceptable performance by the Congress. And I would say in terms of what we need, that partly because you need to treat national security seriously has always been my view. It's serious business. You should treat it seriously. Being in a continuing resolution a third of the time, which has been the case for the last 15 years, is not an indicator of treating something seriously, right? That's treading water. That's not moving forward very quickly. By definition, CRs are not moving forward. And so I think that the tone in Congress is an issue. And to Jane's point, very much like Lincoln said in a slightly different context about slavery, specifically, a house divided itself against itself cannot stand, long ago, becoming an issue with our polarization. So we often think about our workforce needing STEM skills, very important, but civic education is a problem in this country, I think, and we're seeing it manifest now in distrust and lowered expectations. So I think we need to pay attention to that broader skill set, which is a NAPA strength. I think of all the skill sets that we have across NAPA, state, local, federal, defense, non-defense. There's an underlying issue there that is part of why I think we're struggling a little bit right now.
This has been a great conversation. At the Academy, one thing that we try to do is bring together our fellows and experts across different areas. Today, we did this on national security. That's one, to help the public be more informed about what's going on. Two, to give insights to current leaders that can use that insight in their current roles. And three, to continue to have dialogue, because the dialogue is what's going to make us stronger. So please, this was a great conversation. Let's thank our esteemed panel here, Mike, Peter, and Jane. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for listening to Management Matters with James Christian Blockwood. And thanks again to our guest. Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.